So, we've reached the final rule of discernment of spirits by St. Ignatius of Loyola. Remember, there's 14 rules, so we're now on rule number 14. Last week we looked at two rules having to do, 12 and 13, having to do with some tactics that the enemy uses to try to throw us off from following the Lord. And this final one also has another tactic of the enemy as well. I mentioned last time that it's good for us to know some of the tactics that the enemy is doing, just so that we know how to protect ourselves, recognize what's false from him. But our focus is on God, not specifically just on what the enemy is doing. But in this final rule, we learn St. Ignatius, he uses an analogy again. He's going to compare Satan to a military commander. And a military commander who goes and is going to try to surround and besiege a castle to force it to surrender. And so he says this commander, before he sends out the barrage against the castle, he's going to first send scouts to inspect the fortifications, to look at all the walls and everything of this castle, to see if he can find any weaknesses in its defenses, where the wall might be in disrepair, and then that's where the main force of the attack will be focused. And so Jesus himself also said this is how the enemy functions. When he talked about the enemy, it doesn't enter the sheepfold by the gate, but instead he comes in over the walls. And that's precisely what the enemy does. He's going to find the weak point, and that's where he's going to try to enter. So he looks at our souls, looking for where we're the weakest, and that's where he's going to attack us. So he reviews, as this powerful angel, he's going to review as much as he can, looking at us, all of our spiritual defenses. He's going to look at our prayer. He's going to look at our relationships that we have. He looks at, what are the things that seem to give us energy and hope? What things trouble us the most? What disheartens us the most easily? The whole entirety of our spiritual lives, and he will identify the point where we're the weakest, where we're the least prepared to defend against his attack, and that's precisely where he will attack us, at our weakest point. And it's important to realize this is how he functions, because all of us have vulnerable points in our life. There's no shame in acknowledging that that's the case for us. That's the reality of being part of a fallen and redeemed world, is that we have weak points. And admitting that we do have weak points in our spiritual life, then we can do something about it. Then we can seek to defend ourselves from it. The enemy, as the St. Michael prayer says, he's prowling about the world seeking the ruin of souls, right? So he's prowling about, trying to find all those weak points of our souls, attacking us there. So how do we defend ourselves? Well, the first step is to notice where those weak points are, so that we can build up our defenses. So where are my strongest temptations? Are there situations that I can be in that lead me to fall into those sins? We want to acknowledge it, and then we can do something about it. So maybe, I find myself, I'm more easily to fall in temptation when I'm tired. Well, how can I shore up defenses against that? Is there some kind of good habit I can have in those moments? Maybe I just need more sleep. When I'm stressed, maybe that's when I lash out at my spouse or children or coworkers. Do I have a productive means of relieving that stress in my life? Maybe I just need to get outside, or I maybe have a certain vice. Well, what's the opposite virtue to focus on, to counteract that, specifically work on that? Maybe there's a lie that the enemy keeps exploiting against me. So what is the truth, from God's Word, from the Scriptures, to console me and that I need to remember in those moments of attack? If we fortify our weak points, we build up our soul, then the enemy won't be able to breach the walls. And this is very much related with the classic expression of avoiding the near occasion of sin. All right, so you've probably heard of that, to avoid the near occasion of sin. Occasions of sin are external circumstances around us, things or persons, which can entice us to sin. There's all sorts of different things. It's different for different people. That it can be, maybe for some people it's being around a certain person and the things that they do. They can influence us into bad habits. They, influence us to use vulgar language or to gossip. Maybe it's things like, unrestricted use of the internet gets people in trouble, or being alone with an attractive member of the opposite sex, or for some people going to the bar. It's not good for them because they have tendencies toward alcohol addiction. So we all have a responsibility in our life to avoid deliberately placing ourselves in near occasions of sin that pertain specifically to us. And Jesus is very strong about this. He uses strong imagery. He says, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. All right? Of course, he's not saying we should start maiming ourselves and actually do that. But what he's doing, what he's saying is to cut out those situations, those environments that make us really easily to fall into temptation. And that might mean that we have to cut those things out. Certain things that maybe even aren't even bad in themselves, but which for us, because of our weaknesses, become near occasions of sin. And it might be hard to cut those things out. It might even feel like an amputation in our life to say, nope, I don't think I can do that. That hasn't led me to anything good in my life. But it'll be worth it, Jesus says. What profit would there be for one to gain the whole world and forfeit one's life? Right? Instead, give some of those other things up. Certain sinful behavior, even addictive behavior, can oftentimes, be exacerbated by the environment that we're in. And if we're put in that environment, we're almost certain to fall into the temptation. But if we're removed from that environment, then maybe we find, wow, the intensity of that temptation, the likelihood of falling into it, it lessens when I'm not in that situation. So, what do we do to avoid near occasions of sin? Well, we don't want to wait until the temptation already hits us, because oftentimes it becomes too late at that point when we find, man, it's just too strong, I can't stop it. But Rule 14 is about strategizing in advance, right? We're supposed to go around the walls of our soul and look for the weak points ahead of time, right? Where are weak points? And then we put up our defenses against it. So that's the Catholic approach to temptation, is to vices and everything, is not just to do what's needed to resist them, but also to make ourselves be less likely to be tempted by them in the first place, by building up those habits outside of the time of the temptation. So we might ask ourselves, do I really need this thing, this situation, whatever it might be, more than I need salvation from the sin that it gets me into? So for some people it might be, needing to delete certain apps that are temptations to wasting time on the phone, or accountability apps, or having computers in public places. Do I really need to talk to that certain person who ends up being a bad influence upon me? Or maybe it would be better for both of us to enter heaven separately, rather than to lead each other in the opposite direction. So for each of us, this is going to be a different thing of where we're susceptible, where our weak points are. For the young man that Jesus talked to who asked, how do I reach heaven? For that rich young man, it was his possessions and his wealth. That was the occasion of sin for him. It was leading him away from the Lord, and so that's why Jesus invited him to cut that from his life, to give those things away and then follow him. But for each of us, it's going to be different, and so we want to do that. We want to walk around our spiritual life, in a sense, and find where are those weak points, and what do I do to defend it before the enemy attacks.